It was Christmas Eve, 1945, a night that Fayetteville, West Virginia, would never forget. The air was thick with winter chill as the Sodder family gathered in their modest but cozy home. The scent of pine filled the air from the freshly cut tree, and the sound of children's laughter echoed throughout the house as they unwrapped their gifts by the fire. The evening was supposed to be full of joy and warmth, but as midnight approached, an unexpected disaster was about to change their lives forever. Stay with me as we break it all down. But first, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our deep dives into world events. Let's get started. The fire started shortly after 1 a.m. It began in the living room, where a faulty wire on a Christmas light set the curtains alight, quickly spreading to the wooden beams and dry furniture around it. The flames seemed to explode out of nowhere, consuming the home with terrifying speed. George and Jenny Sodder woke to the crackling inferno, their hearts pounding in their chests as they rushed to escape. The fire's rage seemed unnatural, as though it had been waiting for the right moment to strike. Chaos erupted. George and Jenny barely made it out with 4 of their children. Marion, who was the eldest at 17, and the youngest, aged 2, were dragged from their rooms just in time. They stood in the freezing night, their hearts pounding not only from the terror of the blaze, but from the horrifying realization that 5 of their children, Martha, Maurice, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, were still inside. Panic set in as they watched the house burn, their minds racing with thoughts of their children. George and Jenny screamed for them, but the flames grew more violent, consuming everything in its path. Their frantic attempts to save them proved futile. The ladders they had in the backyard were mysteriously missing, as if they had been taken or moved, and the phone lines were dead, cutting off any hope of contacting the fire department in time. When the fire department finally was too late, the charred remains of the house stood as a haunting reminder of the family's loss. But as the ashes cooled, George and Jenny's hearts grew colder with disbelief. The fire department's report concluded that all 5 children had perished in the flames, their bodies presumably burned beyond recognition. Yet, something in George and Jenny's hearts refused to accept this conclusion. How could 5 children just vanish without a trace? Why had they not heard any screams? And where were the bodies? Their suspicion grew as they examined the wreckage. No remains were found. The fire had consumed everything in sight, but not a single bone or trace of the children remained. The only thing left was the unsettling feeling that their children's disappearance was not the result of a tragic accident. As the fire chief assured them that it was a case of misfortune, George and Jenny's refusal to accept that their children were gone forever would set them on a path of relentless investigation. In the months following the fire, the quiet, somber days dragged on, and the grief weighed heavily on George and Jenny. Though they were physically alive, they felt hollow, as though part of their souls had been consumed by the fire. Despite the fire department's conclusions, they could not accept that their children were lost forever. The more they thought about it, the more their minds swirled with unanswered questions. How could the fire have moved so fast, so suddenly, as if someone or something had ignited it with a purpose? Why was there no trace of their children in the wreckage? The answers felt elusive, slipping through their fingers like smoke. George, a stubborn and resolute man, refused to believe that his children had perished in the fire. Jenny, although grieving, was equally determined. They found themselves looking over the fire report again and again, running the events through their minds. The contradictions were glaring. The fire had started so quickly, yet the kids' rooms had been far from the point of origin. Could they have possibly escaped? The idea of a fast-moving blaze was plausible, but George and Jenny were sure they would have heard their children screaming or seen some sign of life in those final moments. But there was nothing. At night, when the house was still and quiet, they would often sit together in the dark, their hearts heavy with worry. "They're out there," George would say with conviction. "They're still alive, Jenny. I know it." Jenny, though heartbroken, never argued with him. Deep down, she, too, felt an odd sense of certainty, an unshakable intuition that their children hadn't been caught in the flames. She began to think about strange details in the aftermath. Why had none of the children been found, even after the fire had been extinguished? The fire chief, who had once been a reliable man, was suddenly evasive whenever they asked about the details of the search for their kids' bodies. He avoided their eyes and rushed through his answers, offering no concrete explanation. It felt as if something was being hidden. In the weeks that followed, the Sodders began looking into the fire's origins more carefully, consulting with experts and even reaching out to a fire investigator from out of town. Their conclusions seemed to echo their suspicions. This wasn't just an ordinary house fire. The evidence suggested something far more sinister. The fire was likely set on purpose. But why? Who would want to destroy their home? Who would target a family that had lived quietly and honorably in this small town for years? Soon, the more they dug into the details, the more unsettling things began to surface. They learned that their children were not the only ones to go missing in the area. Other families had experienced strange events, unexplained disappearances, fires, and suspicious deaths, all of which had been quickly swept under the rug by local authorities. Their skepticism of the fire's official cause deepened as they looked into the strange disappearance of a truck that had been seen near their property the night of the fire. Neighbors reported seeing a large, dark-colored truck parked on the side of the road near the Sodder house. But when the police questioned them, the truck seemed to vanish without a trace. It was as if the vehicle had never existed. This strange clue was enough to fuel the couple's growing suspicion. They soon learned that the truck was connected to a man they had seen around town, a man who had been unusually interested in their children. His sudden disappearance only had someone been watching them, waiting for the right moment to strike? As George and Jenny started asking more questions, the answers they received from the townsfolk became increasingly strange and inconsistent. The local authorities, who had once been helpful, now seemed intent on closing the case quickly, dismissing their concerns. It was as if someone in the town had a vested interest in keeping the truth buried. And as George and Jenny continued to push harder, they began to feel the weight of a town that wanted to forget the tragedy. The once innocent questions began to feel more like a confrontation with a conspiracy. The air in Fayetteville was thick with secrets, and the Sodders were beginning to realize that they had just scratched the surface of something much darker. In their hearts, they knew they couldn't let it go. Not yet. They would never be able to rest until they found the truth. The deeper they went, the more they feared the answers they might uncover. It was just days after the fire, and the chilling silence that settled over the Sodder home seemed almost unbearable. George and her shattered lives. They spoke little, for words felt inadequate in the face of their growing despair. But one evening, as the winter winds howled outside, something happened that would shake their world even further. It was just after 9 p.m. when the phone rang. The shrill sound cut through the quiet like a dagger, startling Jenny as she sat by the fire. George was at the stove, stirring a pot of soup, but he froze when he heard the ring. The phone had been silent for days, the calls mainly consisting of well-meaning neighbors offering their condolences. This time, however, there was something different in the air. Jenny answered, her voice tentative as she picked up the receiver. "Hello?" A deep, gruff voice on the other end of the line startled her. "George Sodder," the voice rasped. "You'll be sorry. Fire's coming for you. Watch your house burn." The line went dead immediately, the harsh click of the receiver leaving the room cold and still. Jenny stood frozen for a moment, staring at the phone in disbelief. Her mind raced, but her body couldn't move. Who had just called? And why did the voice seem so calm, so certain? It felt less like a threat, and more like a warning. But who would want to warn them? George, who had entered the room just as she was about to put the receiver down, sensed something was wrong immediately. "Who was that?" he asked, his voice tight. Jenny hesitated for a moment before speaking. "It was a man. He said that the fire was coming for us." Her voice faltered, the words feeling surreal even as they left her lips. She looked at George, who was now standing still, his face draining of color. He stepped closer, taking the receiver from her hand. "Hello?" George's voice rang out into the empty air, but the line was silent. No answer came. He slammed the phone down, his jaw clenched in frustration. It was him, the one who set the fire. Jenny, shaking, clutched his arm. "You don't know that. How can you be sure?" But George's face was hard, his mind already working over the possibilities. This wasn't just a prank. No one could have known that the fire would strike their house on Christmas Eve. No one except the person who set it in motion. And why wait until after the fire to make the call? Why give them a cryptic warning, like some twisted game? It felt deliberate, methodical, calculated. "I'm sure of it, Jenny," he said quietly, his eyes filled with a grim certainty. "Whoever that was knows more than they're letting on." The call was the first of many strange occurrences that would haunt them in the months to come. But this one, the eerily calm voice predicting their doom, was the moment that planted the seed of suspicion in George's mind. If someone had known the fire was coming before it happened, there was no doubt in his mind that it hadn't been an accident. The fire had been intentional, and whoever had called was connected to it in some way. Jenny tried to shake off the feeling of unease that gnawed at her. "Maybe it was just a prank," she suggested weakly, but George shook his head. "No prank would be that specific. No prank would know what we were going through. This is something else. Someone knows what happened that night." His voice dropped to a whisper, the weight of his words settling heavily in the room. In the days that followed, George and Jenny tried to shake off the eerie feeling that clung to them like a shadow. But the call replayed in their minds over and over. And the more they thought about it, the more they realized the call might have been a clue. Whoever had called knew something that no one else did. Had the person been involved in the fire? Or were they merely a messenger? As the couple continued to grapple with the haunting memories of that night, the unanswered question loomed larger. Was this the first in a string of warnings, or was it something much darker? It was a year after the fire, and the Sodder family's grief had not lessened with time. The days blurred together, the search for answers growing colder with each passing month. George and Jenny had scoured every corner of Fayetteville, asking questions, following leads, but nothing had come of it. The authorities had long since considered the case closed, and yet the aching emptiness in their hearts refused to dissipate. Each night, they were consumed by flames. Still, the question remained: where were they? Then, on an otherwise uneventful afternoon in late summer, an envelope arrived at the Sodder household. It was plain, unmarked, and the handwriting was unfamiliar. It wasn't postmarked locally, which immediately struck George as odd. He'd seen that postmark before, on a letter from a distant relative who lived far beyond the state line. But why would they send a letter now, so long after the fire? He opened it carefully, his fingers trembling. Inside, he found a single black-and-white photograph. The image was grainy, old-looking, as though it had been taken years ago. The picture was of a group of children standing together, their faces half obscured by shadows. They were clustered together, with expressions that were difficult to read, some joyful, some apprehensive, but unmistakably familiar. As George and Jenny stared at the photo, they felt the unmistakable jolt of recognition. The children in the photograph bore an uncanny resemblance to their own 5 missing children: Martha, Maurice, Louis, Jenny, and Betty. Their hair, their eyes, their features, all seemed like a reflection of their own flesh and blood. But there was something off about it. The photo wasn't a snapshot of their children playing, nor was it one that any of them had ever seen before. It was clear that the photograph had been taken after the fire. The clothes the children wore in the image were outdated, and the setting appeared to be somewhere far from Fayetteville. Yet the children's faces seemed so real, so alive. Jenny's hands shook as she passed the photograph to George, both of them staring at the faces of the children they had lost. There was no doubt in their minds. This was a message, a clue. But who could have sent it? And why had they sent it now, years after the fire? George's heart raced as he studied the background of the photograph. In the corner, there was a faint outline of a building, the edge of what looked like a brick wall. It was hard to make out through the haze of time and poor resolution, but the structure seemed too familiar. Could it be the old orphanage near the outskirts of town? The one that had been closed down years ago? Could the children have been taken there? Or was this simply another part of an elaborate ruse to keep them searching endlessly for something that didn't exist? "We have to find out who sent this," George said, his voice low and determined. "They know something. They're telling us our kids are alive, Jenny. They're trying to make contact." Jenny felt a wave of hope, though it was laced with dread. For months, they had been trapped in a web of uncertainty, but this photograph felt like the first tangible proof they had that their children were still out there, somewhere. But the more they considered it, the more questions it raised. Who could have taken the photo? How did they get it to them? Why hadn't they done so sooner? And who else might be involved in this tangled web of secrets? The photograph became a symbol of both hope and fear. The mere thought that their children might still be alive was too overwhelming to fully embrace. Yet the more they examined the image, the more convinced they became that this was no coincidence. The person who had sent it knew exactly what it was doing. They were trying to lead the Sodders down a dark and twisted path that would bring them closer to the truth. But the questions remained. Who could be behind this cryptic message? And what else were they hiding? As George and Jenny plunged deeper into their search for answers, the disturbing reality of the situation began to take shape. The more they uncovered, the more they realized they were up against something much darker than they had ever anticipated. The photograph, cryptic and enigmatic as it was, seemed to pull them further into the shadows of a world they knew nothing about. A world that, as it turned out, was connected to their missing children in ways they hadn't imagined. It started when George stumbled across an old acquaintance at a local tavern, a man named Salvatore Sal Ricci, a man with a past that was both obscure and unsettling. Sal was known in town as a businessman with connections that went far beyond the quiet hills of Fayetteville. He ran several legitimate enterprises, but the rumors swirling around him painted a much darker picture. Sal Ricci was no stranger to the underworld. At first, George had dismissed the whispers as small-town gossip, but as his investigation deepened, he began to hear disturbing tidbits about Sal's activities. Sal had been known to frequent certain backroom deals and had allegedly been involved in a variety of illicit ventures, some of which had even crossed into blackmail and extortion. But the most troubling rumor was that Sal had ties to a powerful crime syndicate based in nearby Charleston. The connection, if true, could explain much of the strange occurrences in the wake of the fire. One evening, after much hesitation, George decided to pay Sal a visit. He needed answers, and no matter how uncomfortable or dangerous the meeting might be, he was prepared to take the risk. Jenny, while concerned, knew her husband well enough to understand that his determination could never be swayed once he set his mind to something. Sal's home was on the outskirts of town, tucked away in a secluded part of the woods. As George approached, he noticed a sleek black car parked in the driveway, its windows tinted dark. He couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding. This wasn't just a casual conversation he was about to have. When Sal answered the door, his expression was guarded, his lips curling into a tight, forced smile. "George, my friend, what brings you here tonight?" he asked, his voice smooth but laced with an undercurrent of tension. "I need to talk to you about the fire," George said, his words cutting through the formalities. "You knew my children, and I know you knew my family. You can't pretend that you didn't." Sal's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, but it was enough for George to catch. Sal motioned for him to enter, and they sat down in a dimly lit study, the air thick with the scent of cigars and aged whiskey. George didn't waste time. "I've been hearing things," he continued, "about you, about your dealings. And I need to know, Sal, what happened to my children? Was the fire connected to you?" For a long moment, Sal didn't answer. He took a slow sip from his glass, his fingers tapping the side of it nervously. When he finally spoke, his tone had changed, more serious, more guarded. "Listen, George, I don't know what you've gotten yourself mixed up in, but you need to be careful. There are things you don't understand, things that have been hidden for a long time." George's pulse quickened. "What are you talking about?" Sal leaned forward, lowering his voice. "The fire wasn't just an accident. It was part of a bigger picture. A bigger deal, if you will. Your family, well, let's just say you didn't end up on the right side of certain people." He paused, his eyes flicking nervously to the door as if he expected someone to walk in at any moment. George's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean? My children? Were they taken?" Sal's eyes widened slightly, his composure slipping for the briefest moment before he regained control. "I'm not saying anything you don't already know," he replied cryptically. "But you're asking the wrong person. There are people in town, in higher places, who don't want this to be dug up." The insinuation was chilling. Sal wasn't denying involvement. Rather, he was suggesting that a far more dangerous network was at play, one that involved not just local criminals, but higher powers in Fayetteville, people who would stop at nothing to keep their secrets buried. The fire, the missing children, the strange photograph, they were all part of something much larger than George had ever imagined. Before George could press for more information, Sal's demeanor shifted again, his tone growing colder. "I can't help you with this, George. There are lines you don't cross. Trust me, it's better you let this go, for your family's sake." But it was already too late for that. George had heard enough. He could feel the truth hanging just out of reach, taunting him. Sal wasn't going to tell him everything, not out of fear, but out of loyalty to someone far more powerful than either of them could handle. And that only confirmed George's. The truth, it seemed, was far more complex than a sigh. The more George and Jenny investigated, the more they began to realize that the fire, the photograph, and the mysterious events surrounding their children's disappearance weren't isolated incidents. They were threads in a much larger, more intricate web. A pattern was emerging, one that suggested their children's disappearance wasn't a random act of arson or an unfortunate accident. It was a calculated move. But by whom? And why? As the months wore on, George's search led him to a surprising source. A distant relative of Jenny's, a woman named Rita Simmons, who lived just outside Charleston. Rita had been a peripheral figure in the Sodder family's life, a cousin who had disappeared from their social circles years ago after a falling out with George's side of the family. No one had heard from her in years, and George had always suspected that the rift between her and the Sodders had been far deeper than the family ever let on. Rita had always been an enigma. Rumors surrounded her. Some claimed she had moved away to start a new life. Others said she had been involved in shady dealings of her own. But what George didn't know was that her disappearance was linked to something much darker than family feuds. It was a chance conversation at a local diner, a year after the fire, that gave George the breakthrough he'd been desperately searching for. A regular at the diner, an elderly man who had known the Sodders for years, casually mentioned that he had seen Rita in town shortly before the fire. According to him, Rita had been acting strangely, almost paranoid, and had been asking unusual questions about the family. Questions that went beyond the typical curiosity of a distant relative. What had Rita been so interested in? Why had she been so eager to know about the Sodders' financial status, their home, and, most alarmingly, about George's business dealings? The old man mentioned that Rita had a way of talking about George, like she knew more about him than she should. She had been particularly interested in the fire insurance policy George had taken out on the house. The policy had been substantial, and George had always viewed it as a precaution, but Rita had seemed particularly fixated on it. Intrigued and unsettled, George decided to pay Rita a visit. When he arrived at her cottage on the outskirts of Charleston, he found a woman who seemed completely different from the one he had once known. Rita's once lively and sharp features had softened, and she greeted him with a thin, almost nervous smile. "George," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "It's been a long time." George didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Rita, I need to ask you something," he began, his voice tight with urgency. "Did you know about the fire? Did you know something was going to happen to my children?" Rita's eyes flickered, a quick flash of recognition crossing her face, but she immediately masked it with an air of indifference. "I don't know what you're talking about," she replied, though her voice lacked conviction. George's gaze never wavered. He could tell she was hiding something. "I know you've been asking around about our family, about the house, the insurance. What are you really after, Rita?" For a moment, Rita didn't respond. She seemed to shrink under his intense scrutiny. Then, almost as if she had resigned herself to the inevitable, she sighed and motioned for him to sit down. "There are things you don't know, George. Things you never understood about your family, about your business," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I wasn't the only one interested in those things. I was just trying to protect you. But I couldn't. I should have told you the truth." The words hung in the air like a slow, burning fuse. "What truth?" George pressed, his voice low, filled with growing dread. Rita took a deep breath and finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "Your children. They weren't just taken. They were hidden. Someone was after them, after your family. But not for the reasons you think. It wasn't just the fire that was meant to destroy you. They were trying to erase you, George. Erase the entire Sodder family." George's heart sank. Who? Who was behind it? Who wanted to erase us? Rita shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. But I can't say. I was afraid of what would happen if I did. They said they would come for me next, if I told anyone." George's mind was reeling, his body tensed with frustration. "You know more, Rita. You know where they are." "Where are my children?" She hesitated, biting her lip as if struggling with a decision. "I can't help you," she whispered. But I know someone who can. Someone who has been keeping an eye on the situation from afar. Someone who knows what happened that night." Before George could ask another question, Rita stood up abruptly. "You need to go now," she said, her voice shaking. "It's not safe for you here. Please, don't come back. You don't understand the danger you're in." As George left Rita's cottage, his mind spun with disbelief. Her cryptic words echoed in his head. Someone was after them. They were hidden. They weren't taken by accident. There was more to this than he had ever realized. Rita hadn't just been hiding something from George. She had been hiding his children, keeping them out of sight to protect them from forces far more powerful than he had ever imagined. MPL case of mistaken identity. The disappearance of the children was part of a bigger conspiracy, one that George was now entangled in, whether he was ready or not. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, George and Jenny found themselves in a relentless battle for the truth. They had uncovered so many pieces of the puzzle, but each new revelation seemed to raise even more questions. The fire, the missing children, the cryptic photograph, and Rita's shocking admission about someone trying to erase their family. They were all part of something much larger, a dangerous and convoluted plot. But there was one obstacle they had yet to confront, and it was the one that seemed to stand between them and the answers they so desperately sought: the local authorities. The fire department's conclusions had been swift and firm, marking the fire as a tragic accident. The case had been closed with no further investigation, but the more George and Jenny probed, the more it became clear that the authorities had been content to let the case slip into obscurity, to bury the truth beneath a blanket of apathy and indifference. At first, they had chalked it up to simple incompetence, but soon it became apparent that there was something far more sinister at work. One evening, after a particularly frustrating visit to the local sheriff's office, George stood outside in the chilly night air, his mind racing. He had asked Sheriff Dale Corbin about the unusual circumstances surrounding the fire, the missing truck, the warning call, the absence of the children's bodies, and had received only evasive answers in return. The sheriff had insisted that the case was closed, that it was a sad accident, and that there was no point in rehashing old wounds. But George knew better. He had seen the way the sheriff had looked at him when he asked certain questions, the way he had avoided eye contact. It wasn't just indifference. It was fear. Fear that George might uncover something they didn't want him to find. Later that night, George received an unexpected visitor. It was a former deputy, someone George had known years ago, who now worked in a different part of the state. The deputy, whose name was Frank Hargrove, had been in Fayetteville during the fire. He had been a low-ranking officer at the time, but he had known enough to see the cracks in the official story. "George," Frank said in a hushed voice, looking nervously over his shoulder, as if to make sure no one was listening. "I need to talk to you about something. It's about the fire. I've been meaning to tell you for a long time, but I didn't know how. You're digging up things that a lot of people would rather stay buried." Frank hesitated, clearly uneasy about the conversation. George could see the tension in his face, the conflict brewing within him. But Frank continued, leaning in closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sheriff Corbin, the fire chief, even some of the higher-ups in this town, they knew more than they let on, George. They knew this wasn't just some accident. But they've been covering it up, sweeping it under the rug. And I don't think it was because they didn't care. I think they were trying to protect someone powerful, someone who had a stake in making sure this case never went public." George's heart pounded in his chest as he processed Frank's words. "Who are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice low but sharp. Frank glanced around again, his hand shaking. "I don't have all the answers, but I know that your kids weren't the first ones to disappear. There have been others, George, people who've been erased, and it's all tied to the same group. I'm telling you, there's a whole network of people involved, and they've got their hands in everything. Business, politics, even law enforcement." The deputy paused for a moment, taking a deep breath before continuing. "You've been asking about a truck, right? The one that was seen near your house the night of the fire? Well, there's a reason no one can remember who it belonged to. It wasn't just a random vehicle. It was part of a larger operation, something shady that the sheriff's office has been trying to cover up. They know about the fire, George. They know what happened to your kids, but they're too scared to do anything about it. They're in too deep." George felt a surge of anger and disbelief. "You're telling me the sheriff's office knew all along? And they did nothing?" Frank nodded grimly. "That's right. They were all too eager to close the case. I don't know if it was because of fear or because they were paid off. But I can tell you this. They've been complicit in keeping the truth hidden. They've made sure you couldn't get any answers. A cold, bitter rage began to build in George. The very people who were supposed to protect them, the ones sworn to serve and uphold justice, had been actively preventing him from uncovering the truth. The thought was unbearable. But Frank wasn't done. Listen, George, I'm not telling you this to make things worse. I'm telling you because you have to know. You've already made yourself a target by digging into this. But if you want to get to the bottom of what happened to your kids, you need to keep pushing. You need to go above their heads. Find someone who doesn't have ties to the people running things around here. As Frank stood to leave, George's mind raced with this new information. The weight of what Frank had said was immense. The law enforcement officers he had trusted, men he had known for years, had turned a blind eye, if not worse. They had kept him in the dark, protected the real criminals, and allowed his children's disappearance to remain a mystery. Now, George knew what he had to do. He couldn't trust the local authorities anymore. He had to find a way to get answers, no matter what it took. But it was becoming increasingly clear. Every step forward in this investigation was pushing him deeper into danger, and the people behind his family's suffering weren't going to let him uncover the truth without a fight. The deeper George and Jenny delved into the mystery of their children's disappearance, the more the sinister truth began to unfurl like a dark, tangled web. Every new lead, every discovery seemed to draw them closer to a shocking revelation. Their family's tragedy wasn't just the result of a random fire or a case of mistaken identity. It was orchestrated, planned, and it all revolved around something they had never truly considered before: money. It began with an innocuous conversation with an old family friend, a man named Victor Harrison, who had worked with George for years. Victor had been involved in the family's business dealings, handling some of the financial affairs, including insurance. George trusted him, even considered him a partner. But the more they talked, the more George began to feel uneasy about their past dealings. It wasn't until an offhand remark from Victor during a meeting at a local bar that everything started to click into place. George was discussing the mysterious photograph and the strange circumstances surrounding the fire when Victor hesitated, as if choosing his words carefully. "You've got to be careful, George," Victor said with a worried glance. "There's more to this than you think. You know the insurance policy. It was a big one, right? Maybe it wasn't just about the fire. Maybe it was about what came after." George frowned, his mind already racing with the implications. He had taken out a sizable fire insurance policy on their home just before Christmas, a decision made out of caution and foresight, never imagining it would come back to haunt them. But now, listening to Victor, a cold realization began to settle over him. What if the fire had been planned for months? What if the goal wasn't just destruction, but something more deliberate? A financial motive tied to the insurance payout? Victor, sensing George's growing suspicion, suddenly grew more guarded. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said, waving his hand dismissively, but his nervousness was unmistakable. "This is all a tragedy, George. Nothing more, nothing less." But George couldn't ignore the cold knot in his stomach, the unsettling feeling that Victor was hiding something. They had been close, too close, for there to be any room for such secrets. George had always believed that the insurance payout would help them recover if anything happened, but now he saw it in a new light. Had Victor known something? Had he been involved in something much darker than George had ever imagined? Determined to get to the bottom of it, George confronted Victor directly the next day. He tracked him down at his office and, without preamble, laid his suspicions bare. "Victor, I need the truth," George said, his voice hard. "Did you have anything to do with the fire? Were you part of some scheme to make sure we lost everything, including our children?" Victor stiffened, his eyes flickering with something close to panic. He was silent for a long moment, as if weighing the consequences of his next words. Finally, he let out a long, ragged sigh, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "George, I didn't want it to go this far. I never thought it would," Victor said, his voice cracking. "I didn't know what I was getting involved in. But I'll tell you this. There are people who were after that payout, George. Powerful people. And they were willing to do anything to get it." George's blood ran cold. "You're telling me the fire was deliberate? That this was all planned?" Victor nodded slowly. "It wasn't just the fire. It was the timing, the insurance policy. Someone had been watching you, George, watching your family. They knew about the policy, and they knew it would pay out big. They weren't going to let a little thing like a tragedy get in the way of what they were after. And that's where I came in." George's fists clenched. "You were in on it?" "I didn't have a choice, George," Victor said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was forced into it. They threatened me, threatened my family. I thought I could control the situation, but I was wrong. The fire was meant to destroy you, George. Yes. But it was also meant to destroy everything that stood in the way of those who wanted that payout. And your children. They were part of it too. They weren't meant to survive." The words hit George like a punch to the gut. His mind reeled. This wasn't just about a house or a business. This was about his children. They had been taken, hidden, not because of an accident, but because they were pawns in a much larger game. And Victor had been a part of it. George's voice was low with fury. "Who were they, Victor? Who was behind it?" Victor hesitated, the fear in his eyes almost palpable. "I don't know, George. I never met them. But I know the ones who pulled the strings. They're dangerous. You don't want to get caught up in this any further." But George was already far past the point of turning back. The truth was clear now. His children's disappearance, the fire, the insurance policy, it was all connected to a much larger conspiracy. Someone had planned this, calculated every detail. And George was the one who had been targeted. Victor, realizing that George wasn't backing down, added one final chilling piece of information. "There's a meeting. A final transaction, George. They're not done with you yet. If you're serious about finding your kids, you have to stop them before they take more." With that, Victor handed George a slip of paper with a time, a place, and a name. An abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town, where a meeting was scheduled to take place. It was the final piece of the puzzle. The ones who had been behind everything, the fire, the insurance scheme, the children's disappearance, were meeting soon, and George had one final chance to stop them. But he had no illusions about what it would cost. The web of deceit was thick, and the people involved were ruthless. He had no idea how deep the conspiracy ran, but now there was no turning back. He would have to confront the dark forces that had stolen his children, no matter the consequences. The air in Fayetteville seemed to grow heavier with each passing day as George prepared for the final confrontation. The slip of paper from Victor led him to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town, an eerily quiet place, far removed from the bustle of their once peaceful community. It had once been a storage facility for goods coming in and out of the nearby coal mines, but now it was dilapidated, its walls sagging with age and neglect. A sense of foreboding hung over the place, as if it had witnessed more than just the slow decay of time. This was a place where secrets were kept, deals were made, and lives were destroyed. George and Jenny arrived together, their minds swirling with the weight of what they had learned. As much as they had uncovered, as much as they had fought to expose the truth, they still didn't know the full extent of what had been planned. The insurance scheme, the complicity of local authorities, and now the strange warning from Victor. It all led them here, to this dark, desolate warehouse. But even though George had uncovered so many pieces of the puzzle, this meeting was the key to everything. Whoever was behind it all, whoever had masterminded the fire and the disappearance of their children, was about to show their hand. As they pulled up, George's heart raced. He scanned the area, looking for any sign of movement, any indication that they were being watched. The place looked abandoned, but George knew better than to trust appearances. He'd learned that the hard way. "Stay close," George whispered to Jenny, his voice low with tension. They both knew that this wasn't just about finding their children anymore. It was about survival. Whoever was behind this would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. They approached the warehouse cautiously, the silence of the night pressing in around them. When they reached the entrance, they hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. The dim light from a single bulb hanging overhead cast long shadows on the crumbling walls, creating an almost surreal, foreboding atmosphere. The smell of dust and rusted metal filled the air. It felt like they were walking into the belly of some forgotten beast. Suddenly, a door creaked open, and a man stepped into view. He was tall, with a sharp suit, and an even sharper gaze, someone who had the air of authority, of someone used to being in control. George's heart skipped a beat. This was no small-time crook. This was someone who moved in the shadows of power. The man's voice was cold, measured. "Sodder, I was wondering when you'd show up." George took a step forward, trying to hide the tremor in his hands. "Who are you?" he demanded. "What do you know about my children?" The man smiled thinly, a cruel, almost pitying smile. "What I know, Mr. Sodder, is that your children are safe. For now. They were never meant to die in that fire. In fact, they were never meant to be found at all." Jenny gasped, her hand shooting to her mouth in shock. George's fists clenched at his sides, his entire body trembling with a mixture of anger and disbelief. He had known deep down that this wasn't just about money. It was about something far darker, something more calculated. "You're the one behind all of this," George said, his voice low but fierce. "The fire, the children, the insurance scheme. You're the one who wanted to destroy my family." The man chuckled softly, almost amused by George's accusation. "You still don't get it, do you? This was never about you or your family. You were just collateral damage. The fire? A means to an end. The children? Well, they're part of a bigger picture. They were never meant to perish. They were hidden, protected. But they weren't meant to come home. Not yet." George's mind reeled. He couldn't grasp what the man was saying. He stepped forward again, his voice shaking with rage. "Who are you? What do you want with my children?" The man's smile widened, and he finally revealed his true identity. "My name is Vincent Vince Moretti," he said with a sharp edge to his voice. "I'm a man who deals with situations, and the Sodder family was a problem. A small problem, but a problem nonetheless." George's blood ran cold. Moretti. The name echoed in his mind, like a bell tolling in the distance. He knew the name from whispers in the shadows, rumors of a powerful figure with ties to organized crime in Charleston, someone whose reach stretched far beyond what George had ever imagined. But what did Moretti want with his family? What could they possibly have to offer someone like him? Jenny's voice broke through the tension, shaky but determined. "You've been hiding our children. Why? Why did you take them?" Moretti's eyes flickered to her, a flash of something like regret crossing his face. "Your children weren't taken. They were protected. You're right to be angry. But don't blame me. Blame the people who created this situation. The ones who put everything in motion. The ones who had a stake in keeping the truth buried." George's head spun as Moretti's words sank in. There was more to this, so much more than he could have imagined. His children had been taken, hidden, not because of some sick plan to hurt them, but because someone else had made a move in a dangerous game of power, one in which George and Jenny had unknowingly become pawns. "You want the truth, Mr. Sodder?" Moretti continued, his voice lowering to a dangerous whisper. "You're a pawn in a much larger game. And your children? They were never meant to come back, not unless certain conditions were met. And those conditions, well, they haven't been met yet." George's mind was racing, his chest tightening with panic. "What do you mean? What do you want from us?" Moretti's smile faded, replaced by a cold, calculating look. "You'll find out soon enough. But until then, let's just say that the pieces are still in motion. And whether your children come home depends on the choices you make next." As the last word left his lips, the door to the warehouse slammed shut, and the shadows closed in around George and Jenny, leaving them standing in the dim light, reeling from the magnitude of the truth that had just been revealed.